Okay, well, welcome to Nashua Historical Society today. I'm Janice Franco. My colleague Paula Lockhead and I are the curators for the bridal exhibit that's at the Abbott House. And we have a very special clothing historian here today, Astrida Schaeffer from Astrida Arts, or from Schaeffer Arts, excuse me. And as a clothing historian, Astrida has a philosophy that history can be told by things, not necessarily by the written word. Astrida, in her business of Schaeffer Arts, does historically accurate mannequins, and she works with collections and small museums, curates clothing exhibitions, and she's also an author. She wrote a book called Embellishments, Constructing Victorian Detail, and has written many articles for textile publications. She's also curated the Irma Bowen collection at the University of New Hampshire, and we're really proud to have her here today.
Hi, nice to see your faces here, and I'm glad to be here. Yeah, I have been working with historical clothing for 30 years now. And I very much do feel that there's a field within history called material culture, which looks at objects as the source of historical information. And in my case, it literally is material because I'm looking at clothing, but it could be American silver, it could be shoes, it could be cookware, anything. But the idea behind it is that the lives of people who don't tend to show up in the history books can be found in objects. And that's especially true of clothing. So the bride wore purple, or why do we think brides wear white? We definitely have a certain image of what brides look like. They are dressed in white, sometimes more conservatively than other times, long sleeves, sometimes short sleeves, but usually it's a floor-length skirt. There's a veil. The bodice is usually tight. It's such a automatically understood piece of clothing that you know that none of these ladies are about to go to the grocery store, right? It's such an understood piece of clothing that it's a costume. It's used as a costume sometimes. This is actually sold as a Halloween dress. So where did we get this idea from? This isn't how we dress. We're in slacks or jeans. Our skirts don't look like that these days. Why do we get married in dresses that look like this? This talk was originally given around this purple dress, but she is an excellent example of what 19th century brides wore. They wore the clothing of their particular day to get married in, not something that was a single-use special dress that was different from what they might wear any other day. They wore something that could be called a best dress. I mean, it has the right shape that we're used to, right? The big skirt. It has, well, something on her head. She's got a bonnet, not a veil. The fitted bodice. But to us, this just doesn't look like a wedding dress. It's purple. Who does that? Our tradition of the wedding dress is a relatively new one. Traditions do change, and for the longest time, the tradition was of the best dress. You wore whatever was fashionable in your day. This is just meant as a quick look how the silhouettes changed over the course of the century. Someone who got married in the early decade is going to be wearing something slender. As the decade goes on, the skirts get more full until they turn into a bustle. They get slender in the front and all the extra fabric in the back. And toward the end of the century, you've got things more of a column in the skirt. A bride from 1810 would never have dreamed of wearing something like this. These are both dresses from the first decade of the 1800s. And the fashionable wear at the time was white cotton. And one of these is a wedding dress. And we only know that because of the historical record that came with it when it was given to a museum. It's that one. But if you can see them, they pretty much have the same shape. They have the same kind of sleeve, the same kind of bodice, the same kind of skirt, the same kind of fabric. It's just that one of them was used to get married in. In the 1820s, silhouettes are still similar to earlier, but they're beginning to change. One of these is a wedding dress. You can't tell just by looking. Again, it's only known because of the historical record. It's that one. And these clothes would have been used again. In the 1830s, again, one of these is the wedding dress. It's that one. But there's nothing really to distinguish it from the other in terms of its cut. And that's certainly not a white dress. For most brides who were of normal means, as opposed to the Rockefellers and so on, this garment worn to get married in really was something that they would then go on to use for special occasions. For as long as it was even remotely fashionable. And then if fashions changed too much for them to successfully keep wearing it and not look odd on the street, depending on where they lived, that could take a little longer than other places, they could pick the fabric apart and make changes to the garment to make it still be usable. Fabric was valuable. But it's not just the lower classes that reused their clothes. This is the wedding suit worn by Louise Whitefield when she married Andrew Carnegie. Not a woman without means. She used the dress not just to get married in, but to go away in on her honeymoon. So it's a practical travel garment. Even for the wealthy, clothes weren't really one-time use objects yet. Simply too expensive. If a bride did happen to wear white, like this dress, the statement had nothing to do with purity or anything like that. It had more of a wealth overtone. Because if you wore something white, it was going to get dirty. And that's hard to clean if it's silk. If it's cotton, like in the first pairing I showed you from the first decade of the century, cotton can be boiled. You can do all sorts of things to cotton to get it clean, which is part of the reason that white was the fashionable color for that time. These garments, yeah, they're white. Doesn't matter if you're the farmer. You can go out there and still boil your dress clean at the end of the day if you chose to wear it out there. It's not to say they didn't have other kinds of fabrics too, but it was perfectly okay for someone with fewer means to risk having a white garment. This woman was never going to be responsible for washing her own dress. And she used it to get married in and then used it later on as a ball gown or evening wear. It is silk, and she's announcing her wealth with it, not her purity. But the tradition of the white dress was coming, and it happened not too long after this. In fact, what happened? Well, it was kind of a perfect storm. There were less expensive materials coming from the textile mills. There were new inventions such as photography and sewing machines and commercially available patterns, which was a totally brand new thing. And a newly global press, so information about what people wore was getting further than it ever used to before, so people could see what was being worn across the ocean. Women's magazines became more and more available, and then the final ingredient was star power, and that was Queen Victoria. So if wealthy brides showed off their wealth in wearing white, royal brides tended to really lay it on. This is Victoria's mother's wedding dress. It is cloth of silver and has gold embroidery and jewels, and she had a crown on and a long veil and a velvet robe. I mean, all this stuff went, this was the wedding dress of royalty, right? But when Victoria got married in 1840, she refused to get married as a queen. She got married as a simple woman because she knew that her husband would never be anything more than the prince consort, that she had the power in the family as the Queen of England, of Britannia, and he would always socially have to take the step behind her. He could never walk at her side. So at their wedding, she wanted to be just his wife, not the queen. So she got dressed in a very simple dress, just a young woman in love. For her, the color was symbolic of her purity, of her innocence. It was a pale champagne silk. There it is in its actuality. No embroidery at all, just a little bit of lace. What the mannequin here is wearing is now wax, but on the day she had real orange blossoms in her hair, not a crown, real flowers. And the dress had a removable train. And it was absolutely shocking to the public that this was how Victoria chose to dress for her wedding. Flowers in her hair like a commoner? I mean, no embroidery, no silver, no gold? No velvet even? I mean, this was, yes, it was silk, but silk was becoming more accessible because of the textile mills. The crowd loved it. It was PR heaven at a time when PR was something new with the global press. And they milked it. There were souvenirs. There's a thimble here, a plate there. It was in the global news the day of and also leading up to it, to the point where there really was a royal wedding fever. There was one commentator who said, "We're all going stark, staring mad. Nothing is heard or thought of but doves and cupids." And on the day, it was pouring rain, but the crowds were waiting. They were there for hours ahead of time to get a good spot to look at their queen marrying her prince. And Victoria herself was just very swept away at the adoration of her people. There was an immense crowd of people at the palace, she wrote, and which I must say never ceased until we reached Windsor Castle. Our reception was most enthusiastic and hearty and gratifying in every way, the people quite deafening us. There were a lot of rose-colored glasses being worn that day by both the Queen and the people, who were in a position for the first time because of the Industrial Revolution of indulging in a bit of mass consumption. They could copy the Queen. They could never copy the Queen before. But suddenly, with this simple dress, she made it possible. So this is a wedding a decade later, 1855. And it very much looks along the lines of what Victoria did. Right down to the bridesmaids also wearing white. Victoria was the catalyst here because her wedding was such a news sensation. It pushed that image out into the world in the way something like that had not yet been done before. That's what I meant by a perfect storm. People did continue to use the older traditions for some time after her wedding. It's not like a switch got flipped, but she really put this idea at front and center. Not only were there newspapers that covered this, but there were dozens of women's magazines in publication by this time. And they saw a good thing and they ran with it because these magazines really were not only guides to social betterment, because they were accessible to women at all levels of society. And the content was geared toward, okay, you have a house like this, but if you decorate it like this and talk to your husband this way, you might have a house like this. Make him these slippers that, we saw on the feet of Duke so-and-so. Here are the latest patterns. And some of these magazines were actually simply fronts for pattern makers. But they featured home management tips and recipes and craft projects and moral advice songs. And it really was accessible to people at all walks of life. Whether or not a woman may have had her own subscription, that doesn't really matter. Women often went in on a subscription with friends or neighbors, or the dressmaker down the street would take the fashion plates and put them in the window. And local newspapers subscribed to these as well for their content. And in fact, this is why we actually have copyright law in the United States, because Godey's Ladies' Book took newspapers to court when they lifted descriptions word for word out of Godey's. And here is one copy of Godey's I have in my collection that very delightfully says on the top, The Enquirer, Dover, New Hampshire on top, because that was a magazine that The Enquirer of Dover had a subscription to. I don't know that it's The Enquirer particularly that got taken to court by Godey's, but this is a good example of how newspapers did take advantage of this material and republish it. And they had to do a little harder work after the lawsuit. Really, the core of the magazine was the fashion. And Godey's described garments had fashion plates. I'll show you one here shortly. But they also included patterns. Now, it's not the way we would think of a pattern. They would give you the image here. In this case, it's an inclusion with the magazine on tissue paper. So you have the image of the dress you're supposed to make. And then that is your pattern. What you have to do is imagine unfolding parts of these to expose the entire pattern shape. So this triangle here would get folded down and become the bottom part of this part of the garment, whereas this trapezoid up here would get folded up. This one here would get folded out to be part of this. You have to really puzzle out what belongs to what and make a mock-up of it to figure out what this pattern actually looks like. And you'll note there are no bits of information on there, unlike in a modern pattern where you have a seam allowance and you make, here's your little dot that you have to line up so that you know that this piece is lined up with that piece. None of that. No sizing, nothing. This is in fact more like a guideline to what your shapes should be if you want to make that garment. So not what we think of as a pattern today, but that's what the readers got. And that's what the fashion plates looked like. They definitely had just black and white ones throughout the interior, but what they were known for were their fold-out pages that were hand-colored. So each magazine that went out had somebody painting on it of the current Parisian or London fashions of the day. And the whole point here was to drive sales, because what Godey's offered was the service of a personal shopper, too. If you liked a particular garment you saw, you could contact Godey's and they would have someone in a more major city get you your fabric and your trimmings and your buttons and whatever all you needed to make the garment you wanted. And Godey's did go everywhere. If that's the fashion plate we just saw on the upper right, here are images: Wisconsin, Oakland, California, Buffalo, New York. Even farmers' daughters saw these. They couldn't necessarily replicate the look on the farm. You can't plow a field or help your husband in something like this. But you know where the ruffles should go on your plain skirt. It was these, as Godey's called them, far-flung ladies that benefited from Godey's sales pitch. And diaries from women of the period bear this out too. There's a small remote town in Wisconsin. In 1853, one woman wrote how she wore her, quote, best Parisian clothes to a party. Except her concept of Parisian came in the mail from a magazine like Godey's. Other magazines also carried patterns, like Harper's. It's the same idea here. You have to unfold everything, but you also have to puzzle out which line is which part of the dress you want. I get a headache looking at this. It's a challenge. And again, there is no real information on order of construction or how to match up curves or anything. You kind of have to know what you're doing. And the surface detailing is also missing. And that's where the fashion plates come in, because you get a pattern, and what you get with that is basically a blank canvas. The fashion plate shows you where the ruffles can be added in the most current style, what kind of ruffles, what kind of trims, what kind of combinations of colors and fabrics. None of that is included with the pattern itself. The pattern is just the blank. Here's an example, also from Godey's, of not a color plate, but a ball dress, and there is your pattern for it. And you'll note that the pattern seems to be missing the skirt. And that's because the skirt at this point is still essentially a gathered rectangle. You don't need a pattern. Take your yardage, gather it up, sew it to a waistband, ta-da. But the trickier part is the bodice, and here at least it does show you that there are darts, which is the mechanism by which you take a flat piece of fabric and shape it to a three-dimensional body. You gather up the bits, or not gather up, you pinch the bits and sew it down to fit. So this would be stitched here and this would be stitched here. They do show that this has a seam here, so here's the front piece and there's the back piece, and that there's a collar, and they show you the sleeve. This must be the side back piece, so this would line up with that. No, that doesn't. Yeah, this would line up with that. But you still have to kind of know what you're doing and look at this as the general configuration of the pattern piece, and what you will wind up with to fit your particular body is not going to look like that. If you're smaller, if you're larger, you're going to kind of go with that general idea of where the darts are and what the swoop of the neckline is, but it's going to look different on every single woman sitting here. The skirt was the easy part to make. The bodice is the hard part, because at this point, you've got the old keeping up with the Joneses. As fashion gets more accessible to people in lower levels of society, the marker of what shows that you are well off changes, and it becomes how well fitted the bodice is to you. Wrinkles are a no-no. If you've got wrinkles, you made it yourself and you didn't do it right. So what happened very often is that women would go to the local seamstress and have help with the fiddly bits of the bodice. But they could handle the simple rectangle of the skirt. But boy, that fit, that was the hard part. And throughout the 19th century, there were different attempts made to figure out how to deal with this difficult, bumpy female figure. Because you don't have sizes at this point yet. There's no such thing as a mass-produced garment for women. For men, there was, in part, especially after the Civil War. You have men's clothes produced by manufactories, literally manufactories, manual sewing. But because no one had figured out a sizing system for women, anything that was a fitted garment could not yet be mass-produced. So there were all kinds of pattern systems that were being patented right and left, dozens and dozens and dozens of them, some of them looking very, very complicated. I actually have one that is similar to this, and it's really fascinating because what you do is you take your bodily measurements. They figured out this thing called a measuring tape, and then you could set the fet screws to match those measurements in the different parts of your body. That included the darts you needed to make the fabric conform to your torso under the bust, everything. And when you finished inputting all your data, I guess it's sort of an early computer in that way, you tighten all your screws and there's your pattern piece. And some of these are actually so well designed that the outside is the cutting line and the inside, this isn't one of them, but the one I have is, the inside is your sewing line, so that the metal becomes your seam allowance. Very clever, but hard to do on yourself in general. And then comes along Mr. Ebenezer Butterick. In 1863, he watched his wife fit clothing to their child from a commercial pattern. They're from a commercial drawing like the ones I've shown you earlier, and watched her size it to fit their son. And the light bulb went off, and he began to produce patterns graded for different sizes. And McCall's soon followed after, and those are two pattern companies that are still around today. But even these were still the blank slates. They were not giving you much in the way of directions or in decorations, because he wanted you to buy his magazine for that. Here's another magazine, Peterson's, which was actually run by a woman. Butterick sold theirs with the delineator. And you can see still, we're looking at still the blank slate. But here you can see how you would make those various parts. Here you would pull it together to raise that into a puff, and you could add the different ruffles, different trim treatment down here. That's an elaborate pleat. And that's where you could go to town on your fashion plates, so you can see what to do with your blank slate. But, that white wedding dress, boy, if you could get people to buy in on that, that's a whole nother market. It's all market driven. The magazine editors knew a good thing when they saw it, and they actively pushed the idea of the white wedding dress on their pages. This was a brand new audience, had never existed before. Godey's published bridal wear right after Victoria's wedding, and only a few years after, they announced, with a complete disregard for fact, that the custom has decided from the earliest ages, from 3 years ago, that white is the most fitting hue for brides, whatever may be the material. It is an emblem of the purity and innocence of girlhood and the unsullied heart she now yields to the chosen one. So, yeah, they start pushing the white wedding. Let's make up a brand new tradition on the spot and pretend we've always had it. And so you start seeing white wedding dresses. I need to say something here about what you find in collections. Looking purely to museum collections to see what was worn in the past can be a tricky thing, because it depends on what the original owner decided to keep, why they decided to keep it, and how they kept it. Those are the very first hurdles. I mean, none of us are going to gift our descendants with our go to the grocery store clothes or our gym clothes. But we might, if it's a prom dress or a wedding dress or some other garment associated with an important occasion, things that matter to you. Hopefully, if you've just made that decision, you're storing it safely, away from humidity, away from heat, away from mice, moths, any other kind of detrimental thing, hopefully in something that isn't acidic and will damage the fabric and eat it away. And then hopefully down the road, a descendant of yours decides to give it to a museum that hopefully says yes. That's a lot of loops to jump through. So what we have in collections is certainly a snapshot on the past, but it's not always a complete picture, which is where looking at the fashion plates and looking at photography and paintings comes in to help round out the understanding of what people wore. Now, all of these are white wedding dresses, but they are all out of materials that indicate these women had means of some kind. And I will bet you anything that all of them were used again. Even Victoria reused her clothes. She was the queen.
Some of them look very gold. Is that age?
Some of it's age, yeah. Yeah. White does tend to yellow. These are also wedding dresses. And we know that because of the other information that came with them when they were given into collections. Godey's may have hinted that, you can use fabric other than silk in your wedding dress. But if that's not really considered good enough for your best dress, it's not going to be good enough for a wedding dress. So that took a little bit of time to diffuse into the population. Also, weddings at this point generally took place in the parlor at home, not in a church. So having a long train doesn't make sense if you're just crossing your parlor. That's something that gets added once the wedding steps into the more formal setting of a church. These are all clothes that turned into the best dress, may even have been in existence as the best dress before the wedding. It's simply more practical. But once you start having the magazines pushing it and pushing ideas like, oh, you have the larger wedding party, and then you have the celebration feast, and then you have the dancing, and then you have the favors, and then you have the decorations, then you start to get more and more women going for the white. Now, these are still pretty darn fancy, so these were not poor women necessarily, yet they didn't go for the one-use garment. I showed you Louise Carnegie's wedding suit before. Even she had multiple elements made for the same suit so she could change them out and have a different effect. So this one suit had 3 different ways of wearing it. That kind of bodice, and this kind of a more coat. And this bodice had the option of 2 different fillers in the front. White wedding dresses could be also repurposed by dyeing them colors, or turned, or retrimmed. Even with cheaper materials now available because of the mills, it was still a hand-sewing proposition, and very labor-intensive. That meant that clothing was repaired and updated rather than made new. You would hand it down, you would recut, you would use it till it became a rag. And as I said, Victoria reused her elements as well. But there was another development I mentioned earlier, photography. What's photography got to do with having a wedding tradition? Well, you might not have that white dress or a big party. Maybe you just went, and signed your names in the town hall, but you could have a portrait taken now. Photography came into the picture in the 1840s. And it wasn't that expensive to go and have a commemorative portrait taken of you on your special day that you could then frame and put on your mantle and have as your very special keepsake. And that means what you're wearing isn't just for that day. It becomes something you're going to look at for the rest of your life and say to yourself, that's what I looked like when I was a bride. And that puts more import on that dress. It gives you more incentive to do something special if you can. It's not for the day anymore, it's for forever. Refreshed every time you look at it in your memory. But there's nothing, we only know again that this is a bridal portrait because it says so underneath, it's written in. And you can see by the dates, this is already headed toward the new century, that people did what they could. If they didn't afford the white dress, this simply wasn't in the game plan. I want to mention something else about this particular image before I move on. People often comment that, oh, they were all so tiny back then. No, people came in as many shapes and sizes then as they ever have. This woman looks beautiful because she's corseted. And she's not corseted to be made to look tiny. She's corseted to look smooth. And that's why her fit is so beautiful of the bodice of her dress, because the bodice is fitted to the corset, not to the woman. And it is, yeah, sure, there's some small wrinkles around the waist. Those are not avoidable. I mean, that's just by moving, you create those. But overall, the fit of that bodice is perfection. That's what the corset is for. It's for good fitting, not for wasp waists. So these couples don't have any indicators other than the handwritten "our wedding" or whatever it might be. Sometimes you do find indicators that are pretty obvious to our modern eyes, such as a veil, maybe some flowers pinned to the garments. She's definitely got a bouquet. Not a common thing to see necessarily. And a headpiece that also signifies, it's not an everyday headpiece. In the photographic record, you do start to see more and more white at this point. In 1872, there's a magazine specifically for brides now, Brides and Bridals, and they said, "The girl who arranges to be married in any color but white takes a sure means of making her bridal doings talked about as savoring of eccentricity." But the truth is, there was still plenty of it going on. The white wedding dresses do begin, but it's not a given yet. And they're still echoing the fashions of their day, as you can see. These marvelous pleats going down the side of her skirt. I love how proud he looks in there. So what changes things is a sewing machine. And that's really what made the single-use white wedding dress possible. It simply sped up sewing. There were so many different versions of sewing machines invented. So many patent lawsuits. It was nuts in the height of that fervor for making this new machine. One of the early inventors, his machine could only sew 6 inches at a time before you had to reset everything. Even so, in a speed sewing contest with hand sewers, he got something like 8 times more sewn than they were able to in an allotted amount of time. You can't fight a machine. Isaac Singer was a failed Shakespearean actor who really wanted to make it big in a time when the economy and the attitude was rife for that sort of thing. He tried a variety of enterprises before he landed on the sewing machine, and his version was essentially mostly stolen from someone else with a few tweaks, more lawsuits, but is really the version of the sewing machine that we have today. In other words, you're dealing with what is a fundamental leap of difference in how you think about sewing. If you're sewing with a needle, you have your needle in one hand and you feed it up and down through the fabric. What Singer's machine does is have 2 different threads, one coming in from the top and one from the bottom, and the mechanism locks them to each other with each stitch. And that means you can go much faster, of course. And it's a sturdier stitch. Because if you have a machine that uses only one thread, what you end up with is a chain stitch. There were chain stitch sewing machines for clothing. You will still find chain stitch machines in industrial use. If you buy a bag of potatoes, I bet you or pet food, I bet you that it has a chain stitch across the top. And if you pull it, you know what happens. It comes undone. And the same can happen to your clothing if that's the kind of stitch you're using. So it wasn't really ideal. So the locking stitch really was key. But what Singer's real genius was not just using the ideas of other people. He consolidated them into a usable unit. He knew how to sell. This was the first machine for the home for a woman to use. And that was a huge barrier to get past. Machines are big and scary. Machines are in the factory. In fact, the sewing machines were very quickly in the factories. But at home, how are you going to introduce this entirely new concept into an audience that has no experience with anything like this at all? No vacuum cleaners, no nothing. This is the first machine. So he introduced sales rooms that looked like pretty parlors and hired pretty sales girls to sit there and show you how easy it is to use this. There were so many different machines on the market, and they all quickly ended up using Singer's approach. But he also introduced such ideas as the star power. If you were the wife of the pastor in town, you could get your sewing machine on a deal as long as you promised to let other parishioners come and look at it and try it. And lo and behold, they would buy one too because it's a great machine. Or rent to own, or turning it in and getting a newer model at a discount. These are all ideas he came up with. Other companies followed suit with similar marketing pushes that worked. This is one of my favorites. This is a advertising card, and it says, "What's the middle-class wife to choose? A new home machine or a French sewing girl?" The horror of what a French sewing girl might do in your home. But look, it's so easy to use. The children are going to be there. They're going to be delighted to have this here too. I'm sure they can play with it as well. Let's choose the sewing machine, not have that sewing girl. So sewing machines started becoming a middle-class trophy. There was a survey done, and that was, I think, the number 3 thing on the list. Having carpets, having a house organ, piano, a sewing machine, and then beneath that was not having the kids go to the mills. But if you didn't have access to your very own machine, your neighbor probably had one, or you could go to your local seamstress and have some help. This kind of brings us back around to our purple bride. She got married in the 1870s. By then, you definitely have white wedding dresses, and the colored dresses are beginning to slip away. She is still, despite what the bridal magazine said, she is not eccentric in her color choice. So she still had plenty of company. There she is. We do know that her means were somewhat modest. She was the daughter of a farmer, and she was marrying a farmer. So for her, a white dress made no sense. She did seem to want a new dress, but we do know in her case that it was a last-minute decision, because the Sunapee Historical Society, where the dress is, has a bill of sale for the fabric. And it is dated, well, it lists 16 yards of the silk with another half yard discounted because it was damaged, all for just under $28. Now that sounds like a lot of fabric, but you have to remember that this is only 19 inches wide, so you need a lot to... When you buy fabric today, it's 45 to 54 inches wide. So 19 inches wide is a lot of piecing together. So more like 6 or 7 yards in a modern day silk. But the communications here that sent her this fabric, COD, from Boston to Grantham, Massachusetts, is dated October 21st, and the wedding was just 8 days later. So the fabric had to get to her, and then she had to make the dress. Why she waited so long, I don't know. Maybe she used her intended dress at her sister's wedding earlier that month and decided at the last minute she wanted something different for her own. I don't know.
A harvest came in.
That's right. There you go. That's a good point. So she had to turn this into a dress 16 yards in about a week. And I examined the dress closely, and these are the basic pieces. And I love doing this. I grid out the fabric and scale the pattern pieces to it to see just what the usage is, because each of the skirt panels is actually from edge to edge. The selvage is what you call the woven edge of your fabric. So the 19 inches, she needed 7 of those, so that eats up yardage. And then she would want to have the most efficient use of the fabric for the bodice and sleeves. I played around with a variety of different possible configurations based on the grain that the actual dress had. Remember that 1/2 yard of this is somewhat damaged. She had enough left to make a parasol and also trim out a hat. So there's plenty there for that. Whether she intended to have the dress have a secondary overskirt, quite possible. I think she ran out of time. I don't believe that she had her own sewing machine. I do think that she went to a seamstress for bodice help, because the bodice is the only part of the dress that has sewing machine stitches on it. And if she had a sewing machine, believe me, she would have used it on the skirt too. Because 7 panels is a lot to assemble, plus the lining as well. So These are the sewing machine stitches. And it's kind of hard to see there, but I know that it's the locked stitch because the thread pulled through a little bit. And also, I mean, I can flip it over and see that there's no chain on the other side. The lining was made out of wider fabric, so she needed to have fewer panels for it. All of the connecting seams here are made with what's called a running stitch, which is very fast. So just in and out and in and out, because none of these seams are going to be weight bearing. There's no load on them. They're just going to hang there. So it's okay to use a stitch like that wouldn't, if you did it on a bodice, the bodice would fall apart on you. But on a skirt, it's fine. And then she basted the lining to the seam allowances of the silk. Because if you line I should have shown one where it's lined up. The stitching lines of the lining don't line up to the stitching lines of the silk, and she didn't want it to flop around. So she pretty much just basted a line of stitching through the lining here and through the seam allowance so it doesn't show on the front of the skirt. But those are honking huge stitches, and it's just there to tack it in place. And there's one seam that closes the entire thing into a tube. And you can see the raw edge of she had to cut the lining fabric to fit the width of the silk. So that's the raw edge, so it had to be whip stitched to keep it from fraying. But this is the stitch joining the entire skirt into a tube. And you can see she isn't necessarily terribly careful. They're not even. They kind of wobble a bit. She's in a hurry. And the skirt has something called a brush braid on the bottom. And that is essentially just a piece of straight grain ribbon that is wrapped around it and stitched down. That's what makes contact with the ground. And that's what gets worn. And that can be replaced. So it protects the silk. So she's got a lot of fabric going around her waist. Let me see, 130 inches total. And in the back, that's where most of the fabric is concentrated and collapsed. That's what all of these pleats are. It's a cartridge pleat. And the way you cartridge pleat is you do a running stitch through your desired pleated width, gather it tight, and then you just whip stitch the very tip of the pleat up against your waistband. The other end of the pleat is hanging free inside the skirt. And that eats up fabric tremendously and creates a nice fall of fabric to the floor. And you can actually see here's a knot. Here's one of the gathering threads. It's broken here over time. And there's another huge knot on that side. Those are the heavier threads that she used to pull the fabric into that tight pleat. And this is what it looks like on the inside. You can see the whip stitches holding one tip of each pleat into the waistband. And on the outside, you can't even see it. That piece of piping there is on the edge of the bodice, and it's a very common way of finishing an edge for the upper body in that time. The rest of the skirt has some box pleats to gather the fabric up. Not some box pleats, I'm sorry, some knife pleats. But most of the fabric is back here. There's very little left to go around the hips and the front. And the opening for the dress is on the left front side with just a hook. There's no zipper, it's just a hook. So the bodice, as I noted earlier, that's really what needs to be fitted. We've seen her before. You can see another example of how smooth that fits. I'm not quite sure what happened here. These dots there in ink were supposed to be the points of the darts that shape the bodice to the body, but they didn't get used. Also, at some point, either in Susan's lifetime or by use in a descendant, the dress got let out. So this dart, you can see where it was by the holes and the remaining thread remnants, but at this point, that has been released to accommodate a wider waist. So either she definitely reused it, or it was reused by a descendant in some kind of a parade or for play. Nonetheless, It's a well-fitted garment. You can see the let-out dart here. There's always a tricky point when mounting a garment for display. If a change like that has been made, do you honor the original shape of the garment, or do you go with the current shape? And in this case, the decision was made to go with the current shape.
So you said that the closing on the skirt was
to the side. Yep.
So is that bodice front all the way symmetrical?
It's down the center. And that's common. Because you don't really want the opening to be there. You kind of want it to be hidden to the side of the skirt. So the bodice is not attached at that point. It flaps over. Yeah. But if you're going to make the garment so that it can be reused later and accommodating a larger size, you have to be prepared, because a lot of things do get reused by descendants, and you just don't necessarily have that information. The buttonholes are done by machine. The early machines had buttonholers and they had rufflers, and that's why ruffles become so prevalent in fashion in the last quarter of the century, because you can do them by machine. In fact, seamstresses often made extra money just by making yards and yards and yards of ruffles and selling those. An interesting and very pertinent to dating this garment and saying that, yes, the date the museum has is correct, is this, what looks like a side back piece, but actually it's just a tuck. There used to be, in decades prior, a separate side piece, but by this point, it's vestigial. It's just that tuck that's made in the outer fabric, and they didn't even bother to make it in the lining. But it's a very tricky seam to sew, and that's not something that a novice would have managed. That's something that a professional seamstress did, because making that curve tuck smooth and not get puckered is really difficult, because the fabric is going to be very stretchy on that tuck. And you can see there's a little jump here where she almost lost it there when she was stitching. There are things that would make this dress limited in its styling. One of those is the position of the shoulder and the armhole. We are used to the green line. We have our shoulder seam at the top of our garments, and then our armhole is very clearly defined. In this period, the seam is set to the back a little bit, and it's very much off the shoulder. And that's hard to alter with styles going forward. There's a lot of fabric in that skirt. She could easily have made more garments with that fabric. That she elected not to points to it really being her wedding dress. She kept it. The trim is just quickly basted on. Again, I think she had plans for more and ran out of time, and then just simply used purchased trim to finish it off. Bodice seams finished by hand, she probably did that. And the sleeve is also done by machine. Just see a little bit of it showing there. Interestingly, this seam, which is hard wearing, if you will, has been whip stitched to protect it from fraying, but not the sleeve. Again, she ran out of time. My only thinking is, never went back to fix it, because there's not all that much rubbing going on. It's a loose enough sleeve that she could have gotten away with that and not losing her seam allowance. Maybe she meant to go back to it and never did. The reason I say I think she intended more is that for 1868, this is the more common look. I mean, sure, you get a single fall, but there should have been a ruffle at the hem. There could have been an overskirt. And it looks like she had enough fabric to do that, but didn't end up doing so. But you can see what I mean about the low, dropped shoulder. It's not a modern line at all. And in the end, it's the sweatshop that gave women the freedom to choose a one-use garment. It made clothing inexpensive and off the rack. The patterns started coming up with sizings. You could order clothing cheaply And seamstresses were going out of business. By 1880, there were 80% fewer solo seamstresses than there had been in 1860 in Philadelphia. They couldn't compete with sweatshop prices. These are selling complete with all the trimmings for less than she bought her fabric for. You can't compete with that. And that brings clothing into a different attitude. It's not as precious as it used to be. These are all the pieces, the mechanization and so on, and the information spread that make it possible to consider a single-use garment. But it really wasn't until the 1930s that it became the norm. And I know that there's another speaker coming who's going to be discussing the 20th century, so I'm not going to get into it very much. But really, with all of the pieces that the Industrial Revolution brought in, it was Hollywood that finished the deal, because movie styles definitely translated into what was sold on the rack and what was available in patterns. Here's Merle Oberon in 1939, and it's not that different at all from what Victoria wore, and Merle Oberon's dress was available as patterns and in stores because there were deals being made between the studios and the dressmakers. So at this point, you're dealing with fashion that is no longer streetwear. It's single use, and it's outside the norm of your everyday. Up until this point, up until the turn of the century, you're still getting married in the fashions of your own time. And that is the end of my lecture. Does anyone have questions?
One of the things that I discovered with the sewing machine is that these clothing manufacturers would advertise in the Nashua Telegraph, and they'd say, if you have a sewing machine, you can make this much money sewing for us.
Interesting.
And that really surprised me. I didn't know that clothing manufacturers were advertising to the home, to the housewife. I mean, ladies in the 19th century still had a tremendous amount of work to do anyway. But to want to have an extra income in the family, this was one way to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, even if you're just doing, ruffles or parts of it, part work, piecework, I'm sure that if you have the machine, that's your opportunity. When it was first introduced into domestic sewing sphere, it was touted as a time saver, but that's not how it works. The minute you have something that allows you to work faster, you come up with ways to do more. Make it frillier, fussier.
No, I just wonder how many people might have responded to that.
Oh, I'm sure.
How many homes actually did have sewing machines here in Nashua?
I'm sure many did, because they were not out of reach. They were designed to be accessible to the middle class market and lower, with the payment plans and with the selling point of being easy to use. There's a woman up in, I think, Wiscasset, Maine. She has some marvelous diary entries where she's just thrilled. She'd gone to Portland to buy her machine. It wasn't a Singer. But her diary is full of her delights with this machine that is allowing her to sew clothes for herself and her daughters in a week. And she calls it the perfection. She's just thrilled because a task that would normally have taken weeks got done in one. She clothed 3 women in her household. She just goes on and on. I mean, you can track it through the months, her increasing delight with her sewing machine. And she doesn't talk about her other chores the same way. It's almost fun.